Good evening, everyone. We just launched our fourth issue titled Ensuring a Sustainable Future, and it's up on our website. Please go check that out. Now, as part of this issue, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jessica Seddon, who will be speaking on the topic Information and Institutions, Some Possibilities. Now, I'm going to read out her bio, but it's very small as compared to the vast amount of work she's done in the field of environment. Jessica Seddon is the global lead of air quality at World Resources Institute and visiting fellow at the Chadha Center for Global India and Princeton University. She earned her PhD in political economy from Stanford University Graduate School of Business and her BA in government and Latin American studies from Harvard University. Her work and leadership focus on developing and implementing social innovations to respond to environmental change. But there's a lot more, so we'll just skip that. But you can always come back and ask her questions about all the amazing stuff she's done later in the Q&A. Now talking about the Q&A, we'll be starting with a Mentimeter. And at the end, there'll be the Q&A round. So please feel free to raise your hands and I'll moderate that bit. If you have any clarifying questions, just put that in the chat box and I'll let her know. So I don't want to keep you guys waiting. Over to you, Jessica.
So, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of you. I know that it's Thursday night and this is really exciting entertainment, but I'm very grateful to all of you for taking the time in the evening, especially to talk with us. So I wanted to start out, I'm going to start out with a little bit of discussion of abstractions, because whenever you talk about information, institutions, social innovations, all of these words can mean many things to many people. So I am going to start out with a little bit of abstraction and definitions, but then we'll get into examples that I think hopefully should motivate all of you to think a little bit differently about what is the value of data and what are some of the new powers and opportunities we have as a society to use the digital revolution differently for sustainability. So as Priyanka mentioned, I am going to start off with a Mentimeter. I'll put it on the screen. For those of you who haven't used Mentimeter, basically you have to go to a website on your cell phone, punch in a code, and then it gives you an answer to a question. It's an easy way to kind of get a visual of what people are thinking. So I'm going to start off with that, and then we'll use that as a motivator for the discussion. So let me just bring that screen up and present. So my question to you is, what is the most influential data we have? What are the most important facts that we know? Another way to think about this is, what's the neatest thing that the digital revolution has brought us? And when you get into the website, you can see that there's an open, there's just basically a text box. And I'm not going to define influential for you right now. So what's the most influential data that we have? I'm curious. I have a prediction for what people are going to say, but I'll comment afterwards. Population. So in a second, I'll also ask some of you why. Personal. Interesting. So you get a couple more seconds. Age, that's an interesting one. Time. So for whoever said GDP, why is GDP the most influential data?
If I said it was me, I said it was GDP. And the reason why I think it is influential is because most of the metrics that we sort of compare a country with originate on the basis of the GDP of that particular year or the previous years. So even something like happiness, to some extent, now people are trying to correlate that with GDP. So which is why I thought that was the most influential database.
So it's influential kind of in the North Star kind of way, like a
Correct.
guiding goal. Great. Population. So for whoever said population, why population? Sorry to put you guys on the spot. I'm just curious about and I should have said what and why, but population. I'm just curious because I have a hypothesis about why someone might say population, especially coming from India, but don't be shy. There's no wrong answer here, by the way. All right, so the population person it chooses to remain. My hypothesis to whoever said population is that you're thinking of the Finance Commission allocations and everything else that's per capita or population based, but that's just maybe because I've always loved the Finance Commission, all of them. So if you want to divulge another reason, feel free to jump in. Social media and social security from other. Who said that and why?
Yeah, that was me.
Okay.
Yeah, so I feel like a lot of data that we give out on social media, on all these social media platforms, has an impact on the whole population, and it sort of has an effect on our behaviors and our habits.
Mhm.
So it does influence us in a big way. And in fact, all the data on Google, that in a huge way has an impact on how we live our lives every single day.
So it influences, so basically the data you give allows and informs another entity to then influence your search rankings. Is that what you mean?
Right, yeah, that's what I mean.
Satellite data system.
Yeah, that was me.
Mhm.
Why did I said that? Because I feel it's very powerful in terms of it controls a lot of elements of our daily life that we do not even notice, right? From telephone to the TV networks that we get, and
Mhm.
there's so much that satellite data controls, from weather and triggering systems and warning systems. I think it encompasses a lot of
Mhm.
areas that we usually neglect.
So that's also a great point. I mean, if you look at the underlying GPS technology and the ability to basically identify a point to identify exact confluence of time in a way that allows you to identify where you are, and that is underneath so many systems we take for granted.
I think the
Okay.
for granted part is with the generation as well, right? Because anyone from my generation and below would not even think that okay, this is something that didn't exist before because they are born in this age. But people before me will understand the importance of satellite data much more. Is what I feel.
Yeah, and and I think also if we ever have, there are these predictions of kind of solar storms or storms of solar radiation that could effectively, or temporarily or for some period of time, knock out our ability to coordinate across electricity grids, locations, and then we'll realize how much everything from financial transactions to electricity depends on it. So you guys are actually really on top of what I'm about to say, because I think a lot of times when I ask that question, I get an answer that is very much about how people make decisions, and that is really focused on how data that enable better individual decisions rather than data that enable sort of system possibilities. And I can see that you're already thinking about system possibilities, whether it's our digital trails and what that means for the ability to customize information that comes back to us. You're thinking about satellite data. My hypothesis on the population mystery person. I think you're already thinking systemically about how information enables new social configurations. But I think it's not it's not as often that when in all of the discussions about what to invest in data and analytics and why to invest in it, what is the social return on information, that is not the first place that most people go. If you read the manifestos of kind of the Data for Good, the Data Philanthropy, the Belmont Forum, which coordinates investment in scientific data, it's really all about investing in data to enable individual decision-making and to improve individual decision-making, or, you know, some imaginary representative policymaker. It's very rarely about how data changes system dynamics and how data enables new institutional possibilities. And I think that's the point with that is especially important for how we govern environmental change, resources, pollution, the whole way we interact with our environment. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of just a framework for thinking about information and institutions. And you know, I'm happy to send over another paper that I wrote about this that has some background, and then go into a couple of examples of how this might work, particularly in the area of sustainability, that hopefully are motivational for all of you in deciding what to do next and how to the extent that you could influence investments in data and analytics, that you can use this. So I think, you know, the key point here is that usually people's underlying assumption about power and the power of data and the power of information is largely about the power of an individual or a leader to become smarter. And I think that is really a very limited set of, it's a very limited perspective on information investment. So just definition wise, when I say information investment, I mean time and money spent on three things. First, the primary capture of information, so sensors, things like that. Second, the pattern detection, so big data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, all of that. All of those new powers that come from being able to detect patterns better. And then third, the directing or sharing of information. So our ability to coordinate across space, time, et cetera, and to move information really quickly. Those are sort of three distinct dimensions of the digital revolution that I think each take time and money to do. And each of those types of interventions, you know, they're not always distinct. For example, much of what we know from satellite data is not sensing. It's actually the analysis and detection of pattern based on a reading of, you know, a change in spectrography, a change in an image or something like that. So these things kind of blur together, but I wanted to call out that it's these three things are information investments. On the other side, the social return on investment is better decisions, obviously. You can characterize a better decision as avoidance of a loss or as somehow closer to an optimization, somehow closer to being able to have, you know, energy efficient refrigeration or, you know, air conditioning or something like that, whatever optimization. But the big piece here that I think is often overlooked, and the part that I'm going to emphasize here, is that information can lead us as a society to better dynamics, better institutional arrangements that allow us to learn faster, whether or not we know it, to adjust to changes, whether or not we're, you know, individually conscious of it, and to respond to signals from the environment and from each other that in ways that lead to getting closer to societal preferences. And this all sounds very abstract, but I'll give you a framework and then I'll give you a few examples, and then we can do questions and answers. So the way that I've talked about this in the past is as something called second order smart. So you have smart as individuals, but also smart in the sense of how information changes the possibilities for relationships between two actors, but also at an institutional or kind of a network level. So these are sort of the three things. You have an individual, you have a bunch of relationships between individuals, then you have the overall structure of the relationships between individuals that forms a network. And at each of these levels, two things about new data or about investment in information changes things. On one, it's there's if you bring in new data, the other is if you change the distribution of access to data. And so if you look through this grid, you can see a lot of different ways in which the social return on data can vary. So at an individual level, if you have new data, you get better decision making. To some extent, whether or not that better decision making matters depends on the influence of the decision maker and their incentives to actually use the data. So it's kind of necessary, but not sufficient. If you change the distribution of access to data, you can create new accountability relationships. You create new decision makers who may have better ideas or better ways to solve a particular problem. At the relationship level, data can make new performance, new contracts possible, for example. So if you have, in India, if you had public-private partnerships that were based on delivery of a certain service level benchmark, that creates very different incentives than, say, partnerships that are based on each actor doing, giving a certain input or building a certain piece of a road. The incentive is very much to do what it takes to achieve the outcome versus simply show, I put these bricks in the right order. Similarly, with on the institutional level, some of the changes in investment and the changes in the information availability has led to a completely new social contract in terms of the surveillance that's possible, the responsiveness that's possible, the level of prediction that can be done, and what that means for, say, predictive policing or other very sort of controversial topics. So I think the point that I want to bring out here is not so much what's in these boxes, but the point is that it's important to think through not just what an information investment gets you in terms of individual level or better decision making, but also what it gets you in the sense of institutional possibilities. And I'll give a couple of examples to ground this. I mean, these are all environmental ones, but once you start to look at information and social relationships this way, you see missed opportunities a lot, and you also start to see a lot of interesting ways that the changes in our digital environment and the changes in our processing power have really altered how society works. So the first example, and I'm not going to talk about the Finance Commission because those of you who are in my class are probably sick of the outcome-based air quality measures there. And I actually picked a different air quality example to show you that it's bigger than just that. The first example I want to bring up is a financial structure that's been winning a bunch of awards. It's called the Breathe Better Bond, and you can see that it comes from the International Finance Corporation, and it won. This is just the project page from the iLab to show that it's winning these awards for being an innovative piece of finance. And what it does is it basically it sets up a structure in which an unnamed investor, something like the International Finance Corporation, can provide funding to cities or regional actors to invest in things that reduce air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in a way that provides returns that are contingent on the air quality returns. So the structure, this is again straight from their project material. The structure is that you have funders on this side. They fund technical assistance, funding for projects, but the return on this bond and the return on these choices is based on the results in terms of a reduction of air pollution. And it has a couple of critical informational assumptions, especially for the results-based payment, which is the part that's seen as most innovative for this. Behind what makes this possible, and what also makes it not entirely possible for every city, is that you need the ability to link the intervention to the result. You need the ability to say, this investment led to X percentage decrease in particulate matter, or in ground level ozone, or in air toxics, or whatever it is that you want to reduce, so that you can make this outcome-based finance or outcome-based approach actually work. And that connection between intervention and air quality response is not something that you can figure out with just a normal before and after, or a differences in differences econometric approach, because atmospheric chemistry, which is the intervening set of processes between emissions and pollution, the fact that emissions react with each other in the air and react with background sunlight, with background pollution from elsewhere, with water, with moisture, it depends on whether or not there are mountains in the background, what's the inversion layer, the level of the height of the atmosphere at which air mixes. So all of these features determine what is the relationship between emissions that you can control through these investments and the ultimate pollution. And so that relationship between what you get in terms of a pollution return or a clean air return and what you've done in your investment requires a fair amount of modeling that in the past has not always been easy to do, because it's been based on chemical transport models. What's possible now through a combination of models, but also use of sort of artificial intelligence to detect patterns that may not be fully explainable, is that you can actually make these connections fairly reliably at much lower cost with much less data than is possible. So this whole innovative feature of this bond, which is an effort to drive finance directly into giving air quality returns, is almost entirely contingent on an advance that's only very recently become possible, because we're better able to work backwards from a change in pollution to what is the change in emissions that caused it, in a way that hasn't been possible until we had the processing power and the pattern detection that we have now. So I think, so that's, that's an area where you had a change in the information possibilities that enabled a change in financial structure. So that's one example. The second example, and this is more of a speculative example, but I bring it up because it's actually very relevant to this year's climate discussions. So methane. Methane, there was a report that came out last week from the Climate and Clean Air Coalition talking about the health and the climate benefits from reducing methane. But basically, you can see on the slide that it has, I won't read the slide to you, but just to summarize really quickly, methane largely comes from oil and gas. It comes from animal agriculture, from both cows burping and farting, but also sheep, and also the waste. It comes from municipal solid waste, and from there's also naturally occurring forms of methane. But anthropogenic or man-made methane largely comes from agriculture, fossil fuels, and municipal solid waste. So basically organic material decomposing. Its impacts in the short run on climate are much, much greater than carbon dioxide. So it has the warming impact, has 86 times the warming impact of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. And in terms of health, it contributes to ozone and to the formation of ground level ozone. So ozone way up in the atmosphere is good, protects from the sunlight. Ozone down at the ground basically oxidizes your lungs. It also damages plants. So plants breathe in the ozone, and it damages their ability to photosynthesize, and it reduces crop yields. The bad thing is actually in India, some of the Indian wheat and rice crops are actually more sensitive than others to ozone. So you get crop yield loss of 26 to 30%, even accounting for drought or other stressors. So basically, methane is something that we would love to really reduce its concentration in the atmosphere for all kinds of reasons. How would we do that? It is a recognized greenhouse gas. It's part of the nationally determined contributions. It's, I think it's a high priority, but we need to figure out how to do better because methane levels have never been higher. And obviously we need to figure out something to do about it. Before I talk about what we could do about it and what might be possible and how new information makes that possible, I want to digress for a second and talk about HFCs. So hydrofluorocarbons are, they're used in refrigeration, and they basically the Montreal Protocol and the subsequent Kigali Amendment had a fairly comprehensive international regime to motivate countries, India, China, US, to reduce their use of HFCs, and in particular, HFC 23 and HCFC 22, so different forms of the refrigerants. And the big thing that kind of came up in the science literature in the last couple of years is this kind of surprise. And you can see this increase in global emissions despite near total expected reductions. That's not so great because these are both warming as well as ozone destroying. And so there is this gap between the estimates of what their atmospheric concentration should have been based on verified actions taken, so actions that were committed and that to some extent, to the best as possible in sort of international treaty verification had actually been taken. And what should have happened if those actions taken had been taken and had resulted in the anticipated reduction in HFCs would have been this green line. So this green line right here, which you notice goes way down, should have been what happens if you calculated from a bottom up in terms of I've met my, in the countries that have reported, I've met my commitments. I have actually done what I committed to do. And I multiply those changes by emission factors. And this is what HFCs should have been down in here. Now this blue line is a top-down estimate from direct observation using a satellite product, direct observation of what are the actual levels of HFCs in the atmosphere. And you can see that they're kind of going in the opposite and wrong direction. And this is what the treaty is based on, is these actions. And this is the outcome. And one of the things that this discrepancy raised, so what happened with this particular discrepancy is there was a fair amount of scientific forensic work to figure out where are these unreported or unexpected HFCs coming from. It was pinpointed. The country that was largely responsible for it seems to have taken whatever action to reduce the HFCs. The HFC trajectory is now back in line with what the treaty says. So, but it was a pretty big discrepancy, even though the treaty was being complied with. So if you look at that and you say, what if we could set methane commitments in terms of outcomes rather than actions? So right now we set methane commitments based on action. So it's like we're gonna, we're going to change the way we do cattle and sheep feeding to reduce the per animal methane output. And then we're going to get this amount of methane reduction, or we're going to put caps over animal waste, or we're going to capture fugitive emissions from fracking or oil and gas development. So there are these commitments around actions. But that's what the treaty is about, is commitments around actions. And to the extent possible, those actions are tracked and whether or not the actions actually happened. But what if we could set the commitments in terms of, I will do what it takes to reduce the methane coming from my territory, my nation, by X? What if we could do that? How might we avoid what happened with HFCs? And the thing is that actually now we can. We don't. And we may not, But we can do that now. So this is one example of a satellite that is actually it'll be launched on SpaceX, but it's an instrument that's about to be launched. But notice this, it says it is designed to do what no single satellite flying today can. We can already do this now using an instrument that's aboard the Sentinel-5 and a combination of ISRO, US, one of the NASA missions, as well as the European Space Agency. We can already pinpoint methane emissions globally at very high spatial and temporal resolution, certainly sufficient to be able to say, in this year, in this quarter, did you meet a certain methane target for your country? The information to go straight to outcome-based international climate commitments is absolutely available. Only in the last couple of years, the TRPOMI instrument, which is the one on Sentinel-5, is 3-4 years old, and their products are just vetted maybe in the last year. But this is a new opportunity, and it's just politics that's preventing us from using it. Because obviously moving to a regime where your treaty commitments and the level of international finance, or whether it's coming from the Global Environment Facility or the Green Climate Fund, or any of the packages that are being developed by the multilateral development banks, if you change that to be based on outcomes rather than compliance with actions, it would be a whole different game of accountability. And we collectively, and our leaders collectively, need to decide to use it. My point is that a change in the level of information that's available, an information investment that's pretty small. I mean, MethaneSAT is actually, it's a non-governmental initiative. It's a philanthropic initiative. So it's tens of millions, but it's not billions at all. We can do this. And the question is, will we seize this opportunity? Because it is entirely possible to change to a new institutional arrangement. The last example that I wanted to bring up, just so we're not all talking only about air quality, is some of what's emerging in the possibilities around self-sovereign identity. So one of you had mentioned Aadhaar as one of the most powerful pieces of data. And I would actually agree with you, except that Aadhaar is in some ways enabled by an India-specific system that it, in some ways, it has the Indian government behind it that says, yes, you are who you said you were. You are now who you said you were then. But the power of being, what self-sovereign identity is it's a use of modern or sort of very recently developed digital infrastructure to be able to identify yourself without relying on an administrative or nationally determined intermediary. So you don't need a birth certificate, a passport. You don't need anybody else to certify you are who you are, or any other sort of individual or administrative entity, that you can create and control your own identity in the digital space. And some of the things that are coming up, that ability to construct an identity with reference to, say, your social network, or to a distributed ledger of a recognition of your past actions, that is opening up a whole new set of possibilities for communities and for becoming part of communities that transcend national boundaries and national financial systems. So this is just kind of a smattering of the academic work, and this is from the International Development Bank. This is a B corporation that is looking at a global public utility for managing your identity, so that you can sort of join and present yourselves and identify yourselves in communities that go beyond what's formed by being a member of a nation, or a member of a professional network, or a member of a whatever else. And I think what these emerging communities of individuals who are able to say, I am the same individual here and now as I was there and then, and not rely on a government to certify that, are turning out to be pretty powerful in the sense of for global coordination, global sharing of money, global sharing of ideas, voting systems. There are some sub-communities within the environmental movement and within indigenous rights movements that actually use some of these technologies to form group votes, to identify leadership, to develop platforms that are then more powerful because they have hundreds of thousands of people behind them. And so they show up in the sort of United Nations or international system as a petition or a statement or whatever, but they're much more powerful than if they came from a group that was not as well organized and could not look back and say, this is the sum of voting from hundreds of thousands of people from around the world who happen to share an identity in a community that isn't recognized in the nation state system, but is recognized among ourselves. And we have this process for determining that this really is a representative voice. And it's starting to come up a little bit. I mean, we see it in North America, for example. There's starting to be a greater recognition of indigenous land rights, because groups across South America, North America, including US and Canada, have started to come together around communities that are around older indigenous communities, and to start to put together joint manifestos and demands about invoking older treaties that actually do give them land rights within the legal frameworks of Canada, US, and Mexico in particular, and to be much more powerful in acting on it. And I think to go back to the question of how does information make this possible, the fact that you can rapidly determine your own network with reference to your past digital presence and your verified, digitally captured relationships with multiple people, that is something that's only made possible by this last aspect of an information investment. And it's a whole new foundation for determining powerful communities. So I think it's something that you'll see a lot more of in your lifetime, and is just a third example of how information has a different form of power than just making better decisions. So with that, I'm going to stop the sharing, and I open it to questions about these examples or anything else.
All right. Thanks. So Professor, I have two questions. The first one is a continuation of what we just discussed about having a self-sovereign identity. Yesterday, we had a lecture by Professor Tudor on nationalism and the rise of it over the last couple of years. So there is this, I mean, from what I understand, there's this inherent conflict, right? Because in one space, you're trying to make sure that the government has more power, and on the other, the individuals are trying to ascertain their own identity. So how do you see this playing out? So this is my first question. And the second one is with respect to this general sort of idea. I mean, I think there's this idea of more data leading to better governance and stronger institutions, especially I think prevalent in India. And how do you think, I mean, do you agree with this belief, one? And second, if it is data, say, on things such as, it's not a quantifiable data in the sense that it's not, say, the reduction in terms of the amount of methane gas that is being produced, but it's something like a better learning outcomes. And then you put an economic incentive to it, say, in the form of a development impact bond. So do you think that leads to corruption of data? And how do you how do we ensure that it doesn't lead to such a perverse outcome? And secondly, do you think it borders on becoming too much of surveillance and not so much independence given to, say, the teachers in this case?
All right. So those are three distinct things. So what's funny, the reason I was laughing is because Maya and I used to work together. In fact, she took the job I had for Joe Stiglitz way back in, so 97 to 98, I worked for Joe Stiglitz when he was the chief economist of the World Bank. And I then went to grad school and I hired Maya and then Maya worked with him. And it's just so funny to have the worlds recollide. Yeah, so very small world. But to that point, I don't know what exactly she said, but I think what I'm trying to highlight is that there are the formation or resurgence of identities other than national that are coming up from the grassroots, that I think with some of these new ability to govern your own identity, form relationships between yourself and individuals who also have an identity that don't depend on an exchange of nationally determined documents, and to vote, to aggregate preferences, to do many of the things that nation states do politically. I think that is an interesting interesting development. So if you think of like the history, like even just around the Bay of Bengal, if you think of like the Sindhi community, the Chettiar community, Tamil Muslims, and the commercial network that extends from the UAE, like right now, what's the UAE, over to Singapore, and the network of trust that exists in a commercial sense, if you were able to move that into a political sense and an explicit unified voice, selection of leadership, demonstration of shared preferences, which you can with some of these new digitally based preference aggregation and identity, you have a whole separate, almost competitive form of community that I think is getting stronger. And where that plays out and how that plays out in the kind of layering of nations. And you could even look at it that the one thing that nation states can do right now is control borders. I mean, to some extent, because if maybe nationalism is the last gasp of the nation state, because it's kind of this effort to say, no, come back to the nation. Because if you look at the early days of nations, when nations were weak, there were all kinds of things that nations did to kind of diminish and destroy these other senses of identity. Like in Russia, so Kazakhstan, all of the stands basically are artificial creations, because there were underlying ethnic groups that had a cohesive identity. And the way that Russia set up its statistical system, or the USSR set up its statistical system, purposely divided these regions into regions that cut across the pre-existing ethnic identity, so that as they developed statistics and as they made it more, made it possible to compare economic or social outcomes across these regions, that they cut across the pre-existing identity. So you could never have one ethnic group be able to compare how it's doing to another, but you could only compare across statistical regions. There's a great book about it, actually. Yoshiko Herrera writes about this. But you see this in Israel. I mean, you see this is history, but looking ahead, who knows? So, so that was the point on nationalism. On this data, does more data make for better governance? Depends on how the data are used. I mean, I think right now, what I've seen in the last few years in terms of governance reforms or state capacity reforms, a lot of it is managerial. These things like, let us do dashboards for tracking electrification of villages. Let us display when everybody clocks in and clocks out of their office. If used well, and the data are kind of protected and valid, and nobody is fiddling with the definitions, and nobody's faking their clock in and clock out, and if time in the office is correlated with productivity, then yeah. But the whole thing is, if you look at it only as in a managerial sense like that, in sort of a principal agent, I'm better able to see your actions so I can control them, you better be measuring the right thing. So if your definition of rural electrification is 2 houses in a village, the common spaces in a village and 2 houses have electricity, and then you put really high-powered incentives by, tracking that and spotlighting it, you're going to get every village with common spaces and 2 houses, because that's what's being rewarded. So there is a danger, what you measure really, really matters if you're going with these kind of data-driven approaches to management. And that's a caution, because it speaks to your third point, which is that, there are lots of ways to fake data. And if there's a lot of pressure on the data, because whatever the data say or whatever financial returns you get, the stronger those incentives are to fake it. And that happens. So I wrote a paper actually on US state revenue estimates. So there's a whole thing about what states are able to borrow based on their projected deficit. And you could see in election years, when there was a premium on being able to borrow more to have kind of in pre-election years, the revenue estimates were systematically worse, and they were basically overestimating the state's borrowing capacity in competitive election years. And that's not data, but it's a state sanctioned process for estimating revenues. And they always got it more wrong in predictable directions in the year before state elections. So, it happens all the time. And that data part is really important, because you don't want to put a lot of pressure on information, have it be wrong, and then really mess up your statistical system. So good questions.
I guess I'll go next. Hi, Jessica. So I had a question about spontaneous order. We're talking about data that groups and institutions and organizations can actually capture and spread out in new forms of power structures can actually enable itself. But in the world that we're living in, there is, in a sense, we have been able to gather more information at an individual level than any time before in the history. That leads to a lot of spontaneous order. Now, is that more dangerous, or has there been a way to capture what happens because of that? Can we model something out of it? Because I feel much of the discussion does not necessarily get into that aspect of it. Because even though we talk about big data, we're talking about sourcing it at a single particular destination. What we're talking about in spontaneous order is the sourcing and the analysis done at an individual level, and that cumulatively has an aggregate effect. Now, how do we understand this particular aspect of information systems?
So if I understand your question correctly, there are kind of two strands of this. One is, how do we handle the fact that more people have the ability to make their own conclusions and to sort of analyze for themselves, rather than go to some sort of central arbiter of truth and fact? So one is, how do we handle that? Is that more dangerous or not? And the second is, given that there's more people are getting disparate information and feedback, that you have kind of a social dynamic that is more likely to look chaotic. That was and how do we handle that? Did I capture it right? Okay. So on the first, I think the short answer for both of those is, it is what it is. And it's not really ours to control. It's ours to cope with and steer. And I think some of what's happening is that we, on the first part of everybody has their own facts, and everybody, there are no single arbiters of truth. I think in the long run, that's probably good. In the short run, it's really destabilizing unless we adjust and develop new ways of filtering. And that's the part is, I don't think our brains and our social expectations and have kept up with enough. And there's some interesting, in the collective intelligence world, there's some interesting things coming up about how do you use a combination of sort of human intervention and AI decision algorithms to filter information to sort of come closer to a shared understanding. I don't know what's going to happen with that. It's a very sort of crazy world right now. When you have like a private company, you have Facebook deplatforming the US ex-president. Many people are very happy about that, but the question is, should they actually have that power? So I think this question about the quest for truth is one that we have to think, how do we adapt as social beings and the society, because technology is not going to solve it for us. But again, putting this in historical perspective, this is not new. So if you look at like the history of objectivity, the beginning of objectivity was in the early days, in a scientific sense, it was because capturing information was so difficult. Explorers would go out and they would capture the single ideal type of something. Like if it was a flower, it would be like the ideal type of the flower, because you couldn't just take a picture. You had to paint it and capture it and put it in an atlas. Then as it became easier to capture information with photography, it started to be objectivity is a replication of the actual truth, and we can have 50 different flowers and we can capture them easily. And objectivity is, showing all of that. Then it got even cheaper. So instead of 50 flowers, we had 5,000 flowers. And so objectivity became what the scientists determine is the appropriate combination of those 5,000 flowers. And that filtering started to come back in. We're even further than that, and we haven't adapted. So that's the first one. And on the second one, I think we need to be able to let go of this sense that we can control and manage, and think, and actually of the older way, almost like the sort of some of the Buddhist ways of thinking about steering society with small, simple decision rules that in the aggregate lead society to be, like, if you think of this right action, right thinking, those are simple, immediate decision rules that don't say I'm going to figure out the whole problem and work backwards. But if you add up from those small actions, you sort of trend in the right direction. And that's a big reconfiguration of what governance means. And I think we have to get comfortable with it, because otherwise we're just going to be defeated by the weight of so many random things that are happening. That is an optimistic statement, because I think we can figure it out, but I think it's on us as a society to figure it out.
Okay. I'll ask my next question. Yeah. So my question is more towards national security. So when we talk about data, we also know it is very powerful. Powerful in terms of a weapon as well. So if we advocate for good governance and more data to be open towards people, but we know countries like China, for example, do not have open sources of data. So how do we counter that element that we want national security for our country, we want good governance, but we also don't want open data to become a weapon. So yeah, that tussle is very difficult to take in.
Yeah, no, it's I I'd say the way to sort of maybe think about the frontier in terms of cybersecurity and national security around information. I mean, you almost have to read science fiction to then think, okay, what's actually true now and what's an issue. I mean, if you look at, the concern about surveillance and the concern about like Huawei, for example, which, India, US, I mean, it's very hard to think of 5G networks without components that could potentially open up the ability to look into all of those and the ability to intervene through that and affect, say, gas pipelines up the east coast of the US right now, elsewhere. There isn't, again, I mean, I think there's no way to go back to a world where you can, it's a little bit like water, right? You can dam it, but eventually it'll leak. And so we need to think of what's the way to work with it and to contain the consequences of those leaps and to reduce the interdependencies, rather than assume that we can, keep our infrastructure systems or data close to us. So that's one. The second is to, I think, invest very differently in national security, in the sense of investing in cybersecurity and cyber resilience, rather than thinking of as a conventional sort of, there's the military, there are the soldiers, and here are, the civilians. Because in some ways, when you start to look at this, how you can use information, it's all around us, and there is no distinction.
But when you say that there's no distinction and we can invest differently, do you think close countries with closed data systems are a threat to the global chain of data that we have created now?
So data nationalism is a fact. I mean, whether it's everything has to be in cloud servers that are within our country, never mind what we have as energy costs. I think it is a weakness to it. It has its disadvantages to require that to have a lot of restrictions on how much data can flow across borders, where it can be hosted, what servers it can pass through. That imposes additional costs. It imposes additional infrastructure costs. It reduces the interoperability. From an environmental perspective, it's really bad because if you have, say, data on the glaciers. In fact, this shows up actually in the Himalayas and in looking at the water system around Southeast Asia, China, and India, the fragmentation of data because the data aren't pooled. Less if you can't pool. And for environmental reasons, things like weather, clouds, water, we want to know more, and we want to know in a more integrated and seamless way. The costs of that fragmentation are very much there. The benefits in terms of security or safety from misuse of the information have to be weighed against it. And in some cases, it may be completely justifiable. So I think it's a different cost benefit depending on the type of data. And where it gets really messy right now is for, say, environmental data. Those data do have economic and security implications. And so they're kept within, behind national firewalls at a cost of knowing the joint risk. And that's a problem that like the World Meteorological Organization is really struggling with. And it's not just nations, it's also public and private. So the best source of weather data in Africa right now for the continent is actually private mining companies, because they have a need to know when these super cyclones are coming in. And so they've invested a lot in it, but they're not sharing through the World Meteorological Organization. So they're not going into these kind of global models of understanding weather and storm severity, because commercially there's no incentive to do that. And that just diminishes what we know as a species, but it's privately understandable. So I wish these boundaries would go away. I don't think they necessarily will. I'm always happy to talk about this kind of stuff, but I think this is a very gray area that all of you are going to have to address in your lifetimes. And there are no right answers. And I think the first step is to at least think about it and attempt to muddle through. And that's what we can do. So, and yeah, and I hope all of you and your families and everyone else are all stay safe and everything else. So it was really nice to talk with you.